Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert. We're going to go through target E3, which says that you should be able to explain the principles of natural selection and how they change a population of living organisms. Now I want you to pay very close attention, that is, to what this target is saying. You need to not only be able to list the principles of natural selection, but you need to be able to apply them to a situation. So for test purposes, you should be able to take an organism or a situation that I give you and explain how these four different principles of natural selection would work to cause a change in the population or the species of that organism. So we already touched on these four in target E1. But Charles Darwin came up with this theory of natural selection, which again, a theory explains how evolution, how living things change over time. And his theory has these four parts. Genetic variation, that all organisms of sexually reproducing species, they're all different. And think back to our heredity unit. You know that things like crossing over and mutations and independent assortment of alleles are some of those factors that cause there to be genetic variation in sexually reproducing organisms. All living things tend to produce more offspring than the ecosystem can support. So if you look at the mice that I breed in my classroom, I think I remember the very first pair of mice that I had, the one female literally had 167 offspring from August when school started to the end of May when school ended. So that's way more, and that's just the offspring from that one female. Now mice become sexually mature and can have their own babies when they're about 6 to 8 weeks old. So imagine if some of those babies then had babies. Think of all the mice that would, the room would be full of mice running everywhere. So this is true of all living things, from mice up to elephants. They produce more offspring than the ecosystem can support. Struggle for existence because of that overproduction of offspring, because there's too many organisms. There's not enough resources for all of those to survive, so they have to struggle to survive. They have to compete with each other. There's a survival of the fittest that goes on. And then the last, and this is, some students know the phrase, but they don't know what it means. And of course, knowing what it means is most important. So even if you don't memorize the phrase, it's differential survival and reproduction. So know what it means. And it just means that because of that struggle for existence, some of those individual organisms are going to die. Well, which ones die? Well, the ones that aren't best adapted, that don't have traits that give them an advantage, they're going to die. The ones that do have the traits that give them an advantage are going to survive and pass those on to their offspring. So we see genetic variation in all kinds of living things that reproduce sexually, and yes, as we talked about earlier in other units, even plants reproduce sexually. So here we have some varieties of different kinds of carrots in a population of deer. Yeah, they all look kind of alike. They all have white tails, and the males have these antlers. They have white spots you can see around their eyes. But if we started taking measurements of each individual deer, there are differences between them. And here's some Labrador Retriever puppies, and you can see again they all kind of look alike. Labs have a certain characteristic look to them, but if we started looking very carefully and taking measurements, we would find differences in each and every one. Overproduction of offspring, cockroaches. I think I read that a pair of cockroaches, if they reproduce and all of those their offspring reproduce, at the end of a year you'd have over 1 million cockroaches. We've already talked about the mice example, how quickly they reproduce, and even elephants, which typically have one and sometimes two offspring at a time, but usually it's just one. But within the herd itself, they're going to produce more babies than can be supported by the ecosystem. So there's this struggle for existence. At first you might not be able to see what is in this picture, but look carefully and you can see, oh yeah, there's a praying mantis who's actually captured a frog by the leg and is going to eat it. So all living things have to struggle to survive, even if they're not carnivores, of course. These elk are battling for probably breeding rights, but they're struggling for food and shelter and water as well. And then differential survival and reproduction. So some individuals are going to die, but those that do survive are going to reproduce, and that's a very important part of this. Sometimes students remember the differential survival part, but they leave out the reproduction. And the reproduction part is important because that's those that do survive, of course, are those individuals that have traits that gave them an advantage, gave them a little bit of an edge to begin with, so they're going to pass those traits on to their offspring, and you're going to see those traits probably more and more in the population, and then that's how evolution occurs. That's how the population or the species changes over time. So some important points to remember. It's the most fit organisms for that particular environment at that particular time that reproduce and pass those traits on. And of course the environment can change over time, and then it's possible that those who had the best traits at that time, they might not be the best traits anymore, and they might need to change. So also, this is important, we are always talking about species or populations when we talk about evolution. Organisms, individual organisms, don't and can't adapt. They can't develop traits. Sometimes students get confused. They think, oh, well, if you take an organism that's used to living in a cold environment and put it in a warmer environment, it will adapt, and it'll maybe lose fur or hair as it adapts to that warmer climate. And that does not happen. Within a population, if you had a population of, let's say, polar bears, and it suddenly starts getting warmer, well, some of the polar bears, because of genetic variation, are going to have a little bit less dense fur, and those then, if the climate is getting warmer, might have an advantage and outcompete those that have the normal fur, and then they're going to survive, reproduce, and pass that trait on to their offspring. But an individual polar bear, of course, can't change how much hair it has, because that's determined by its DNA, and then an individual organism can't change its DNA. So this is very important. We don't ever say an organism adapts or evolves. It's a species or a population of organisms that adapts or evolves. So going back to our giraffe example that we used with Lamarck, how would Darwin, through the theory of natural selection, say that giraffes' necks got to be as long as they are today, if long ago they were much shorter? So we start out with that assumption that long ago all the giraffes had short necks, and again they're herbivores. They eat leaves on trees, so they would eat the lower leaves, and they would eat them until they were gone. Well, some of the giraffes in the population, because of those things like crossing over, independent assortment of alleles, sexual reproduction, they had just a little bit longer necks than the other giraffes, and they could outreach some of those leaves that were higher on the trees, did so, and were able to get more food and had a better survival rate then than some of the shorter necked giraffes. They survived and reproduced, and when they had babies, they passed on that little bit longer neck trait to their offspring. So over time, through many generations of this happening, the giraffes' necks got longer and longer. Notice how this differs from Lamarck's theory. Lamarck said that the giraffes actually stretched their necks out during their lifetime and acquired longer necks during their life, and then passed that on to their offspring, that their offspring were born with longer necks because their parents had stretched them out. So you can see how Darwin's theory, hopefully you can, how it differs from Lamarck's. And I'm sure you could see the 4 principles of natural selection in that explanation. So if you have any questions about that target, please make sure you ask.